Thanks all for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today to talk about software vendor cybersecurity concerns. This is a growing area of concern in cybersecurity circles. So BPM's cybersecurity assessment team, we've been doing this for a long time, been doing this for over 20 years. We are an assessment-only group. We don't dilute our brains with any other knowledge or expertise. We're just offensive security experts. We can be objective in our assessments because, again, we have no conflicts of interest. And, of course, our remediation recommendations are always intended to be the most cost-effective possible. As a result of this, we're really not experts at planning, building, or managing information security controls. That's the job of your IT team or other departments in BPM or other companies. We're simply experts at defeating information security controls. So that's all we do all day long. And so today's presentation is really going to provide you what we consider are commonly called ethical hackers. So we're going to provide you the ethical hackers point of view on cybersecurity issues. Myself, I founded the cybersecurity assessment team at BPM back in 1998. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, so I think in terms of security all day long. I have degrees in physical chemistry, so I also think like a scientist and seek support for theories before I arrive at conclusions rather than the other way around. I like to ride my bike. So for today's presentation, we're going to just take a quick look at the problem, discuss the situation that we face. Then I'm going to show you a couple of examples of software supply chain attacks, so vendor application attacks. And then we're going to talk about some things that we can all do about it to try to manage this problem. The problem that we face today starts with overall at sort of the macroscopic level, a worsening threat landscape. So unfortunately, from a cybersecurity perspective, it just keeps getting worse. You know, cyber criminals and nation-state entities involved in cyber warfare have long since discovered that the barriers to entry are very, very low. Tools are out there. You don't have to be ninja-level experts to perform cyber attacks. The risk of capture and prosecution is low to moderate. Law enforcement is getting better at identifying and prosecuting cybercrime. That's great, but still, it's only a low to moderate risk for a cyber criminal. And of course, the return on investment is very, very high. For very little investment, a tremendous return can be gained by cyber criminals or nation-state entities performing cyber warfare. We see some bullets there, all the reasons why the threat landscape keeps getting worse. You know, the pandemic has presented us with wonderful opportunities to use pandemic-related scripts and themes to enhance social engineering attacks. We continue to see secret hackers tools released into the public domain, and they're getting weaponized all the time. Boundaries are blurred between systems, and we're going to touch on that a little bit today. It's very, very difficult to know anymore where your information systems end and someone else's information systems begin. The Internet of Things continues to increase the attack surface area that the attackers have to target, and there are newly documented vulnerabilities being released at a dizzying rate. But that top bullet there in blue, software vendor supply chain vulnerabilities, that's really going to be kind of the focus of today's threat landscape discussion. And the SolarWinds breach that some of you probably saw headlines on around the late December, January timeframe, this SolarWinds breach is really the impetus for today's presentation. Historically, a lot of the headlines that you've seen about breaches have come from one of these attack techniques that typically occur post facto. They occur after the system or application already exists. It's already out there as a commercial or open source entity, and somebody takes advantage of it. So social engineering, again, this is something that's been enhanced during the pandemic. You all have probably received social engineering attacks during the pandemic. Talking about your stimulus payment, or talking about where to go to get a mask, or new CDC guidelines that are on a malicious link, or whatever those may be, emails, texts, phone calls. those types of social engineering attacks are very, very common. A large breach that some of you may not be aware was perpetrated by social engineering that was a big headline was the big Twitter breach last summer, where a bunch of Twitter accounts, high-profile Twitter accounts, were compromised. And that breach was actually perpetrated by social engineering. Social engineers literally called Twitter support, impersonated insiders in Twitter, and got tech support to divulge credentials, which they then used to perform their hack. So that's a very high-profile example of a social engineering attack. Credential compromise, this is also very, very common. Another 2020 example of a big credential compromise was the Zoom attacks. All those Zoom bombing events and things like that. Credential compromise and insecure use and handling of credentials is what led to that compromise. Patching exploits are very, very common. A few years back, the big Equifax hack was perpetrated by a patch exploit. So Equifax had a piece of networking gear facing the internet. It was way out of date. They hadn't been patching and updating it, and attackers were able to just waltz right in and exploit the missing patch because of the dereliction of duty of the folks at Equifax. Misconfiguration breach. Vendor default configurations are a big source of concern for misconfigurations. A real insidious attack that involved a misconfiguration breach was a company called Verifications.io. Verifications is one of those awful companies that goes out onto the internet and just scrapes up lots of information from all over the place and then sells it to sales lead firms and things like that. They were hacked because of an obvious misconfiguration where they just literally left a database open to the internet that was supposed to be hidden behind a firewall. Boundary incursion, again, it's becoming increasingly difficult to determine where your system boundaries end and someone else's systems begin. The most famous boundary incursion example would be the famous Target hack, where the Target hack began with a breach of the HVAC or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning vendor of Target's, which then had that vendor had access to Target systems, and that access was then exploited to increase privileges and go from there. And then code logic abuse. So that's taking advantage of miscoded applications. And so every time you hear about another Microsoft patch or another Adobe patch, there were some big headlines early this spring from Sonic Wall patches. These are all code logic abuse attacks. And so when a vendor releases a patch, it's probably because there's some vulnerability in the logic of their software code that needs to be hardened or protected. Not all patches are security patches, but a large fraction of them are. So that's kind of the historical background. That's the vast majority of historical headline breaches. So what's so special about the SolarWinds breach? The key aspect of the SolarWinds breach is that it happened post facto. It happened pre facto. It didn't happen after the application already existed. It happened during the development process. And this is a growing concern for attacks. SolarWinds is an industry-leading network management application. So organizations with large networks that need to monitor and manage their complex systems, SolarWinds is very popular. It has extremely high privilege levels on people's systems. So when a company deploys SolarWinds, that SolarWinds usually has what's known as administrative rights on the network. And it's very, very widely deployed. Over 18,000 businesses and federal agencies apparently downloaded the vulnerable SolarWinds code. The SolarWinds attack was called the Sunburst. It's been named the Sunburst Trojan. And a Trojan is a piece of malware. It's a piece of attack software that tries to act like everything's normal. It tries to hide in plain sight. So this Trojan didn't do anything to interfere with normal functionality. The application just worked as normal. In fact, this Trojan actually went out and looked to make sure that the application was actually deployed on an enterprise network, not in some sandbox or test environment somewhere. The code itself was purposely obfuscated, so it was hidden to make it look like it was non-malicious code. And the communications traffic that the Trojan used was also made to look like ordinary traffic. So this is a very stealthy piece of Trojan software that looked at its environment, it hid its own code, it hid its own communications traffic, but it resulted in opening a backdoor communications back to a command and control center. It's likely been in production since March of 2020. So just imagine something that ran rampant on everybody's network for 9 months or more before it was actually identified. And the truth is, this is almost certainly not the only case out there of software that has been breached during the development process. It's just one that we know about. And frankly, if the attackers had not targeted a security research firm, we may still not know about it. It was a security research firm known as FireEye who detected this. The Department of Defense didn't detect it. Health and Human Services didn't detect it. Lots of other large government agencies and large defense contractors didn't detect it. But thankfully, a security research firm was targeted and they did detect it. Otherwise, we still may not know about it. Lastly, there's some evidence that SolarWinds used some popular software development tools that may have been what led to the compromise of the SolarWinds code. We don't actually know that yet. But that's what makes SolarWinds different from all of these traditional sort of historical breaches that you've read about in the headline. Most of these either haven't been identified yet or they haven't made the headlines. So really what we're faced with is trying to secure the unknown, right? There's layers upon layers of suppliers and service providers that lead to the development of these software applications and systems. And there's just no way to see through all those layers of supply chain. And that's really what we're looking at in this image here, is trying to understand where it all came from. And this is a big issue. Here's a simple example of in this case, this is an online banking application. So very, very common application out there in the world. We all use online banking applications routinely. And what you see on the left there is a diagram showing the online banking application, and the platform there, that's the actual application. And then the little boxes around it are all the things that it talks with and interfaces with. And in that red outline, those are all external entities. They are external to the application. And so this application, in order to deploy an online banking application, it requires a tremendous amount of integration. And it's really difficult to tell where the application ends and the third-party applications, like the core system, which would be the core line of business system for the bank, or the the credit card processing, merchant bank, or some people like that. All these external entities are integrated. And on the lower right there, you see a list of some of the application interfaces and batch processes that go back and forth between the application and all these third-party entities. It's really difficult to know where boundaries are and to manage security around those boundaries. And increasingly, applications also rely on third parties, and the amount of code has just mushroomed in the last few years. So at the top there, we see some of the bullets there that most commercial software that's out there these days has not been written by a single application developer or even a single team of application developers. It's been those groups plus a whole bunch of third parties, and lots of applications use free open source software in their products. And you can see there, 66% of companies, survey companies, create software that relies on open source code. 97% of proprietary apps use some form of open source code. So it's out there, and the vendors that you're paying money to are using it. And at the bottom of the slide there, you see the increase in code size that's just increased so dramatically. 51% of people surveyed said that their code size has grown more than 100 times in 10 years. And some of them said 500 times as much. That's a tremendously rapid growth in code size. Open source dependencies. So again, these dependencies on open source code are really quite dangerous. So here's a typical example. Bootstrap is very common, very popular toolkit used for web developers. It includes a bunch of key tools all in one place. And it has been indicated by some surveys that over a quarter of all websites have used Bootstrap in their development. So that's quite a lot. That's a big fraction. Bootstrap itself, that toolkit, contains over 800 dependencies. So these are dependencies on pieces of code that other people wrote. So when you think Bootstrap has built this great toolkit and then it's all been vetted and it's ready for you to use, it is a great toolkit, but there are 800 dependencies in it that have not all been properly vetted. And when it comes to applications that need high permissions, this is a really big concern. So again, using our SolarWinds example, SolarWinds has administrative level privileges on networks. And we can see here lots of examples of high privileges. I'm not going to read all these bullets off to you. You can read them yourself. But certainly high privileged and privileged credentials. That's what we as security attackers, that's what we do all day long, is compromise credentials and then seek to escalate privileges. A piece of software that already has a high level of privilege is a great endpoint for us to attack. So we did a little research last year. We had one of our assessors track 27 internal penetration tests. So that's inside people's systems. This assessor was doing work, and this assessor did 27 engagements last year. And you can see some of the types of applications and what they like for privilege levels. So in 27 engagements, this assessor found that 27 out of 27 of those engagements, the backup software on the system had administrative level privileges. And then you can see other applications. The fourth one down there, network management, that's our SolarWinds application. Found 15 instances of that out of 27 tests. So as you can see, in basically every test, there are some instances of applications with high privileges. And here's some of those applications broken down out of those 27 engagements. At the very bottom there, the most common we see is Veeam. That's a piece of backup software. And then next, coming in at 6, there is our SolarWinds. So again, our key culprit that we're looking at an example of today. So this is a big issue. As attackers, we seek out these applications because we know they have high privileges and they give us basically the keys to the kingdom. So when it comes to supply chain, software supply chain attacks in the context of the threat landscape, stakes are at an all-time high. With the advances in external security systems, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, good awareness and training for employees, attackers have moved their focus from attacking the external perimeter to moving to the softer interior. And supply chain attacks require a little higher entry, right? They're not as low a barrier to entry as just taking advantage of a patch. It actually requires some investment up front, some coding work up front, but the motive to make that investment is very, very high. Between ransomware and crypto mining, corporate espionage, going after intellectual property, or just harvesting credit card information is such a high return that it's worth it for that investment. And of course, these recent high-profile breaches, again, using SolarWinds as our example, has shown that really nobody is safe from this type of attack. By compromising a trusted application, hackers get that foot in the door already. It's a super high return on investment. And of the 18,000 installations of the compromised SolarWinds package, the attackers were so busy, they had so many targets to choose from that they only chose a handful of the highest value targets. And the rest of the 18,000 breaches were left basically untouched because the hackers didn't have enough people to take advantage of all the breaches they got at once. And so this is a really big hack. So let's take a look at some examples. Now, we're talking about SolarWinds today, and SolarWinds has kind of dominated the headlines, but this has been going on for a while. The first really well-documented example is back in 2015, where another development environment was compromised, ended up at the Apple Store where people could download it, opened up a remote command and control from Xcode. Another example, EV log. This is an event log viewer where people view logs, Windows logs. It's kind of a management tool like SolarWinds. In this case, they broke into development servers that were missing patches, and they stole a key. So you can think of a key as sort of a password to everything. And using that private key, they were able to get into the actual code and then plant their malware. Another interesting example is EventStream. EventStream is just a streaming toolkit. It's an open source tool that was originally developed by this fellow named Dominic Tarr, a very prolific developer. But this is an open source, so it's free. Nobody's paying for this software. It's just a lot of work for someone to maintain. And so what we see in number 2 there is a hacker known as Right9 Control donated some free work, some innocent changes to some of the code that was welcomed by the community. I mean, this was a good Samaritan doing good things, making it better. Eventually, this Right9 Control asked to just own the code and take it over from Dominic, who was, again, busy on other things and wasn't paying Dominic any money. So he was happy to unload it to this entity. And then this entity, who was looked at as a contributor and a good Samaritan up to that point, then began their malicious activities and started embedding malicious code into this open source application. So there's a kind of a social engineering example, if you will. And then, of course, the SolarWinds example. Again, we kind of went through this already. SolarWinds was a very stealthy Trojan. It was placed in a DLL. That's a dynamic link library, and a DLL is a piece of software. It's kind of a service that lots of different aspects of the application can go and use, and so that made it a very central part of the application that was beneficial to hackers. Again, it was very stealthy, looked to make sure that it was on a real network, looked to make sure that it hid its traffic in plain sight by looking like ordinary traffic, and then set up remote command control. And then here's just one example from one of our hacks. No presentation from our team would be complete without showing an example from one of our hacks. So here we see a simple little, again, we're going to use an online banking system as an example. Very simple hack. But what we see is this is an application that relies on a third party. And this third party had a weakness in its code. So what we see here is in Roman numeral 1, we're going to log in as user Daisy Duck, and we're going to look at our bank statement. And then we're going to initiate a search. And when we do that in Roman numeral 3, what we show there, this is just a little screen showing us us tracking the conversation between our browser and the server. And what we see is the application is actually reaching out to a third party for something called an iframe. An iframe is just a way of embedding a document into a web page. And so we take advantage of that because that third party service is not checking our account number. So in Roman numeral 4, we log in as a different user, Donald Duck. And then in Roman numeral 5, we do the same kind of search, but in this case, we take out Donald Duck's account number and we replace it with Daisy Duck's account number. And now in Roman numeral 6, Donald is now looking at Daisy's account information. So very simple hack. This is one of those dependencies that so many applications have embedded in them these days that we took advantage of to break in. So what's common about all these? They're targeting developers, they're abusing dependencies, they're using a piece of software as a launching point or springboard. Those signing keys, we saw a couple examples of that. The software gets distributed via updates, very common. Oftentimes, these attacks are going undetected. And of course, there's lots of monetary or nation state motivations for these types of attacks. So here are some of the common questions now we're faced with. What can we do about this? How can we perform vetting on complex pieces of software? Why would anybody care about my little organization? We're too small, we're too remote. What do I have for sensitive information? Is what I'm doing good enough? If we're using compromised software, what can we do again? And how am I supposed to prioritize some hypothetical situation when we're facing real problems right at hand? So these are the kind of questions that we and everybody is faced with right now around these software vendor supply chain issues. And the simple facts of the matter is we don't have all the answers. We're gonna talk about some things we can do about it, but the truth is there are no simple or single answers to this really intractable problem. So let's spend the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about some of the potential solutions, some of the things we can do about it. First and foremost, the best thing that we can all do as far as laying the groundwork for defending ourselves against these types of attacks is to adopt a standard. So we're going to look at NIST as a standard here. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They publish a wonderful set of library, if you will, of guidance on information security standards. And they have a number of excellent documents on these vendor supply chain issues. In particular, that NIST special publication 800-161 has a really good set of guidance, and they talk about supply chain risks as insertion of counterfeits, unauthorized production, tampering or theft, insertion of malicious software and hardware, poor manufacturing and development practices. And those three in italics there are basically cover all of the examples we just looked at a few minutes ago. And these are what attackers are taking advantage of right now. So NIST has properly identified the risks and has good guidance for defining standards for how to deal with those risks. So that's really the foundational place that we want to start, is looking at standards. Now, we all have different roles in our organizations. So here are just a couple pieces of guidance for folks who have different roles. If you are a software developer or your organization does software development, there are some really important things you can do. First of all, first and foremost, we talk about these third-party services, libraries, APIs that we have for our software, and we really need to do some homework on those third parties. And we'll talk about a little bit that homework in just a moment here. Become involved in the open source community and contribute. Become aware of best practices. OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. They have wonderful guidelines for developers on how to avoid logic issues in their code. Resist the urge to add security after the software is already built. You really need to invest in securing up front. And security is not a point-in-time exercise. This is very important for developers to remember as well. Once the code has been developed, training, code review, code analysis, the kind of testing that we do, these are all part and parcel of keeping up with the threat landscape. As systems administrators, for those of us who have responsibilities to actually manage the systems, limit the number of products, right? And then this is really difficult to do, right? Everything is in the cloud these days. Applications are, in the cloud, and it's very, very easy for users to start using an application without the IT even really knowing about it. Additionally, as systems administrators, need to assume you're going to be breached and adopt what's known as a zero trust model. Maybe we can do a presentation on zero trust sometime, but basically zero trust means isolating, segmenting, protecting data stores above everything else in a way that presumes that your systems will be compromised and just go from there to minimize the damage or impact. Restrict application permissions that ask for domain administrator rights. So a product comes in and says, I need to be an administrator on your network. Need to really question that. Is that truly necessary? Perform routine log review and establish a baseline of what normal traffic looks like, particularly outbound traffic. It was indeed outbound traffic that led the security research firm that I discovered the SolarWinds breach to initially recognize it. And then move beyond signature-based intrusion detection and anti-malware, right? These are what are known as zero-day attacks. So traditional antivirus software works by having a library of identifiers that are indicators that something has gone wrong. And if the piece of malware that's on your network corresponds to triggering one of those indicators, then great, your anti-malware is going to work, your antivirus is going to work. But if it's something new or something different, that traditional model of intrusion detection and antivirus is not going to work anymore. Again, the SolarWinds hack, they hid the communications traffic in what looked like normal SolarWinds traffic. So it really need to move beyond those old signature-based models. As security professionals, it really, again, you need to incorporate that standard, whether it's NIST or in this case, MITRE is a wonderful toolkit out there for security professionals. Stay abreast of everything and subscribe to the breach notification tools that are out there for your benefit. As business leaders, which probably a number of people present today are, there's a couple of things that you can do as well. First of all, the most important thing you can do as a business leader is to just build a culture of security awareness and support. So make cybersecurity part of the conversation. Lead by example. Make sure those cybersecurity rules apply to you as well as the rank and file employees. And allocate adequate resources, right? Cybersecurity is pretty much lives strictly on the expense side of the ledger. And allocating resources can be very painful because there's no real return. There's only a risk of loss. There's no real chance of gain. So working in that negative environment can be difficult to allocate proper resources. And don't overrule the security team's objections, right? Everything is a rush. Everything is a hurry. We've got to get this software out there or we're going to lose a competitive advantage or whatever the situation may be. And you need to allocate sufficient time to perform the due diligence that the security people need to do. Be transparent in the event of a breach. We only know about the SolarWinds attack, how it worked, how it functioned, what happened, because a security research firm was the first one to find out about it. And this research firm was very open and forthcoming about what they found. And that allowed us all to become more secure as a result. We're all in this together, and we need to act like it. And then lastly, and we're going to wrap up here with some vendor due diligence best practices. Okay, so it's really about vetting your vendors. So when we get the potential third parties, what we need to do is vet them before we buy their software or their system, right? The only time we have leverage in our relationship with vendors is before we buy something from them. After we bought it, we're just another client and we've lost all our leverage. So a vendor questionnaire that the vendor either responds or fails to respond to can tell you a lot about the culture of cybersecurity at the vendor. We're really looking to see if we give them a questionnaire, do they answer the questions? Are they prepared to answer the questions? Can they escalate to the people who know the answers to the questions? And how these responses occur tells us a lot about whether that vendor has that culture of cybersecurity or not. So here's some sample vendor due diligence questions. And if you're not a technical person, don't worry. We're not going to get too caught up in the acronyms and technical stuff here. But some of these are detailed technical questions. Some of these are sort of general, broader questions. So first of all, you want to ask the vendor about their supply chain. So what portions of the system or application were outsourced by the vendor? Do they have controls in place to manage their supply chain? Do they have controls in place to manage and secure their source code? Do they have code that's been reused from code sharing resources, previous editions, things like that? Those vendors should be able to answer those questions. How do they handle patching and updating? How is remote support handled? Can you restrict remote support requests to just a known good set of internet addresses, or maybe have certificates or some other kind of control to make sure we know it's just the vendor, not some third party? And then we need to ask vendors about how communications are going to take place. What does normal traffic look like, so that we can then identify the anomalous traffic? And again, can we restrict that communications traffic? And how much traffic is it expected to generate? All these questions a vendor should be prepared to answer. And then the privilege issue. What accounts are there? Are there any undocumented accounts? What privilege levels are there for accounts? Even in 2021, there are still vendors out there who provide, and I'm not going to name any names, but there are at least a couple of manufacturers out there who sell printers, like printer, copier, fax machine type devices that have completely undocumented, high privilege supervisory accounts on them that the installation technician doesn't even know exist. It's nowhere in the vendor's documentation. But of course, the hackers all know about it. It's in all the hackers' databases. And that kind of undocumented, high privileged accounts are a tremendous Achilles heel. And so vendors should be able to answer those questions. And then we get down to some of the technical details of encryption. So how are data encrypted both in transit and at rest? And this is really important stuff, because encryption is great, right? A lot of us have, we use email, and email is generally encrypted in transit. Most modern email systems in 2021 use TLS encryption for email going between point A and point B, and that's great. The problem is it's not encrypted at rest. So it's just sitting in your inbox or sitting in your sent box, unencrypted. And we break into mailboxes all day long. And when we do that, we just use wonderful Outlook or Gmail search features to search on critical words like password or confidential or SSN, or you name it. And so that's just one example. Data need to be encrypted not only in transit, but also at rest. So in your sent box, in your inbox, in the backup files, in the memory of your computer, maybe hard-coded into the application, maybe in log files or configuration files of the system. All of those places may have sensitive information that's not encrypted when it's at rest. And then all integrity controls. So when we think about integrity, we're thinking about the validity of the data that's going back and forth. So when we see these words here, these acronyms, SMB and LDAP, these are digital signature tools that validate the sender and recipients of communications between computers that increase the integrity. And then lastly, on our checklist of vendor due diligence questions is, may we include the vendor systems in our testing regimen, right? Can we test your system to make sure it's secure? And if you won't give me permission to test your system, will you provide me with evidence that you have ongoing testing being performed on your system or application? So if they won't allow you to test their application, they better be prepared to share with you their test results, you know, the cover letter at least from their test vendor to show that they've been doing their due diligence on their end. So this is a long, very technically detailed list of vendor due diligence questions, but we'll provide this this presentation for you after this morning, and you can feel free to copy and paste this into a document. And we strongly recommend that you use this as a template for vendor due diligence questionnaires. It's going to reveal a lot. Again, some vendors are going to answer this all right off the top. Others are going to refuse to answer it entirely. And that is going to tell you a lot about the vendor's culture of cybersecurity. You know, it's not a test. They're not going to get an A or a B or a C on it. We just want to know whether they're actually doing this stuff and they're prepared to respond to this or not. And that is really the best thing that you can do to manage your supply chain risks. So that's it. We'll wrap up here right at a quarter of the hour here and open it up to any other questions. So hopefully we've figured out this morning that applications are both growing in both size and complexity, and they're incorporating lots of external code. You know, the days of a piece of software being sort of a monolithic piece of code that's been built by one person or a team of people is over. Software now is a series of services that interact with each other, and those dependencies create tremendous vulnerabilities. You know, the threat landscape is daunting, but contrary to popular beliefs, cyber supply chain attacks are not that new, right? We saw an early example from 2015, so they've been around for at least 6 years, almost certainly longer than that. They just haven't been very well documented prior to that. The SolarWinds Breach has demonstrated just how incredibly devastating a well-funded, well-organized attack can be, and we are far from understanding the full impact, no doubt. And you know, given what we found in the last few months, it's unlikely that any of us have the resources within a supply chain to completely prevent a compromise. And again, it's only because the folks at FireEye were targeted, and it's probably because the attackers probably wanted to steal some of FireEye's research, that we even know about it today. It still might be flying below the radar, undetected by intrusion detection with its carefully hidden communications transmissions. It might still be out there and would still have it. What we can do, though, is prepare for the next inevitable breach and harden our networks. Follow best practices, you know, adopt a standard such as NIST, enforce least privilege on everything. Don't let applications and systems have administrative privileges just because they ask to. Perform that vendor due diligence. Take the time, stop when you got this hot new application that's just got to get on there so that you can use it. Just stop and take a minute, send them that due diligence questionnaire, see how they deal with it. And then, of course, always, continuously, never stop training users to be suspicious and report anything that they see that may be out of the